Welcome back to another episode of Sacred Wild Man. My name is Roy, and today's topic is going to be about overcoming porn addiction, an alternate approach. Now, porn addiction is perhaps one of the biggest topics related to men's issues. Most, if not all men, have had some experience with looking at pornography or experiencing a porn addiction themselves. And this was the case for me for many years of my life, and it was something that I tried many times on my own to quit, with some success for very short periods of time, and then ultimately returning back to it. And so this is where I would like to present an alternate approach towards quitting porn for men out there who still experience themselves having a porn addiction. Because a lot of the approaches out there, I think, are too limited in focusing on symptom management or symptom reduction. Basically meaning reducing the frequency you look at porn little by little or for good. And I think it's reflective of the Western mind or Western medicine, Western psychology approach, which is that there's always this focus on the symptom. It doesn't ever really get to the root cause for the symptom in and of itself. Here's one of the things that when I tell some men, it can be initially very surprising and jarring to hear. This was the same for me when my therapist first told this to me, is that there's probably a really good reason why you're looking at pornography, and that underneath the behavior of seeking out porn is a need. There's an emotional need, and that emotional need in of itself isn't bad, isn't wrong, isn't something that needs to be erased, but needs to be paid attention to. And for me, that was such a huge reframe around my behaviors of seeking pornography, because it helped take my attention away from what I thought was the issue. Because our brains, our egos love to spin stories about something. So when we say something like, yeah, I just have a porn addiction, or I have an addictive personality, we adhere to those stories to justify our behavior, when those stories may not be true at all. And so this is where getting to the need underneath that behavior is most important. The other piece about most of the approaches out there, which you might have experienced trying to work things out with an accountability partner, right? Somebody to keep tabs on you, you keep tabs on them, or you try to encourage one another, like, all right, let's keep up on your streak. Perhaps you've tried NoFap, right, where you don't look at porn, don't masturbate, don't ejaculate. You just try to keep your streak and direct that energy somewhere else. Maybe you have went through some programs that involved even doing something as far as having password protected phone or computer, so locking your electronics so that you cannot access porn. Again, all of these things only address the symptom. Now, if it has worked for you as a man, great, you don't need to watch this video. But for those who have found that these interventions have not helped in the long term, one thing to consider here is that when you have so much focus on not wanting something, right? I don't want to look at porn. Your rational mind might think it makes perfect sense. The more I don't want something, the more I should be, having that thing not happen, because I don't want it. That's not how your subconscious mind works. Your subconscious mind only responds to the intention and attention you are giving, which in this case, if it's so focused on not wanting something, the attention is on not wanting something, and the intention your intent of not wanting something carries a specific energy, specific frequency to it. Think about the difference between someone who says, I'm okay with the fact that I have not yet conquered my porn addiction. Notice what the energy feels like around that. Versus someone who says, I really need to quit porn. I can't keep doing this. I've tried everything to avoid it, but I keep going back. But I'm going to double down again. I'm going to keep my streak going. And I'm going to not look at porn for this entire month. The energy feels very different. One is in a place of more acceptance, though not necessarily saying that they want to continue. The other one is more in this kind of angsty place. It's so attached to not wanting to repeat this behavior, yet that only feeds into the energy, right? Because your subconscious mind is focused on that energy and the not wanting. All that does is create a feedback loop. You keep churning around in that frenetic energy of not wanting something, of avoidance. And it builds up and it builds up and it builds up, and eventually it releases itself in some indirect manner. And usually in a way that that man does not want. Usually that's when the streaks break. So with those points laid out about how some of the established approaches or the common approaches people take are lacking in their effectiveness in the short term, or in the long term, they're only short term effective. Let's look at some of the alternate approaches that I would like to suggest. So the first is working with the feeling, not the story. As I mentioned earlier, there's a good reason behind why your behavior of looking at porn, seeking porn, exists. Because underneath the behavior, there's a feeling, there's an emotional need. And up until that point, porn has only served as the only tool you know of to try to meet that need. So let's take a look at some examples of what these emotional needs could be. Let's say you are a chronically angry person. You hate your job, you don't get along with your coworkers, you are perhaps in a relationship that you don't enjoy, but it feels better than being alone. But you just have a lot of dissatisfaction with life, and so you have a lot of anger built up. At the same time, you have also internalized messages, beliefs about your anger. And perhaps that was, growing up, when you expressed your anger, you were met with criticism and judgment. You were upset about something, so you expressed your anger, and then you had maybe some adults in your life say, good boys don't show their anger. Good boys always behave. So what did you do? You closed that part of yourself down, said, all right, my anger is clearly unacceptable in this household. Therefore, the angry part of me must be bad, is a problem. So I can't express that part of myself. So then you start to repress. You repress your anger. Therefore, you also have a problem with being able to speak up for yourself. Right? Because if you do, it feels like you're accessing your anger, and because you believe that's unacceptable, it can't be expressed. So it gets shoved down and repressed into your body mind, and it stays there because that energy doesn't disappear. It stays within your body, your nervous system, and within your psyche. Now, the only way you can release your anger, because emotional energy seeks release, right? It seeks to move. If you think about emotion, energy, and motion, it can't stay stagnant for very long. It takes a tremendous amount of energy, actually, to hold all of that anger in. So you reach a boiling point, but you don't want to hurt anybody, right? Because your anger has been labeled as bad by yourself. So you can't express it to people around you. You go to porn, you look at some porn videos that help you feel powerful, in control, you blow your load, and then it feels like you have released that pent-up energy for a period of time, and then it keeps building up over and over on repeat. In this case, the actual need behind the behavior is, I need to express my anger. I need to use my anger in some constructive way to likely make changes in my life. So as long as such a man doesn't make the changes in his life, right? Let's say he continues to stay in that relationship that isn't good for him. He continues to work at a job where he hates his coworkers, he doesn't get along, and the job sucks for him. It's only a matter of time before the anger builds up again. So really, the anger is saying, we need to draw a line and we need to make a change. We can't keep doing this. So that need in and of itself, underneath the behavior, is actually really important, and what is actually seeking the validation and attention of that man. Another example might be boredom. This is something that I have experienced, many men have also shared with me, is that sometimes they just look at porn because they're bored. You think about the statistics over the past 2+ years with the pandemic and the isolation quarantine measures, the viewership of porn skyrocketed. And, well, what do you know? It's because we were isolated, cut off from perhaps our communities that we are normally part of, and so we're just stuck alone, not sure what to do, right? And when you're stuck and alone, you have to deal with your thoughts, you have to deal with your feelings that normally you might be able to avoid because you can just continue with the life patterns that help you to not pay attention to those things. Now that's all gone, you have to deal with it. And it can feel very threatening because ultimately, I think most men use pornography as a tool to cope with feelings that are difficult to handle, that are difficult to tolerate. They don't know what to do with them. So when you're feeling bored, then in this overstimulated Western world where we're constantly getting dopamine hits, you're conditioned to keep seeking novelty. You need to be occupied by something. You can't stand silence, being still for very long. So with that hardwired into your pattern and behavior of living, you're going to try to seek something novel. Now, it might be easy to say, oh, okay, so the need underneath that boredom is to seek something novel. Sometimes that could be the case. My personal view is that when you feel bored, a deeper need behind that might actually be more spiritual, in the sense of connecting more deeply with yourself, your inner world. What is going on in here, as opposed to what's going on out there. And this is where people who have done things such as long meditation retreats or even therapy, anything that gets them to look inward, have experienced huge benefits and powerful shifts in their day-to-day lives. It's because they finally looked inward. They realized, I can't ignore myself anymore. And the boredom might just be sometimes a need to avoid myself. I can't bear feeling bored, so I gotta avoid that. I gotta look at something else so I don't have to feel bored. So those are two simple examples of the emotional needs underneath the behavior of seeking porn. Another thing you can look into, or a resource that I'll put in the description, is a book titled Lost Connections by Johann. He also did a TED Talk titled Everything We Think We Know About Addiction is Wrong. And he talks about this experiment called Rat Park. And so it's a really great illustration of how oftentimes what we're really needing is connection. Connection with ourselves and connection with other people around us. Community. And so when we don't have that, it's much easier to turn to these substances that we then become dependent on because they are fulfilling a basic need, albeit in a distorted way. So I'll put that in the link. I highly recommend that you check it out. The second alternative approach is to investigate the symbology behind the porn that you consume. This is one that I highly recommend doing with some sort of a professional, whether that's a coach, a sex coach, intimacy coach, or a sex therapist, or just a therapist. Someone you can talk to about these things who doesn't shy away from the topic. Because the symbology behind the porn that you consume actually provides another place to get to what is more the core issue, as opposed to just focusing on, oh, I have a porn problem. This was something that I explored with my own therapist when we first broached the topic. I had shared, I feel very embarrassed about talking about this, but I need to talk to you about some of the porn that I consume because there's a theme here, and I have to imagine that there's something important about these themes. And he's like, absolutely there is. Let's dig into that. And one of the things about symbology is that it helps to externalize what is going on internally within our own psyche. So an example would be, let's say, men who enjoy looking at porn involving dominatrix. Oftentimes, these men can be either high power CEOs or in some position of authority in their life. They have a lot of control. They call all the shots. They run a very tight ship. But in this one area, it's the only area where they are completely surrendered and letting go of control. Right? Because the whole idea is that the dominatrix, she is the one in control, and you are at her mercy. In this case, the symbology might express a deep desire within that man to actually let go of control, right? To be able to surrender to something bigger than himself. Because if you're always in control of everything, at some point you kind of get tired of that, right? And there's a desire to be able to, let someone else or something else take the reins, and you can just go along for the ride. It's no secret, to me anyways, why 50 Shades of Grey did so well with women, because there's the exact same concept there. There's this attraction to the energetic component, right? So it's not necessarily always about you enjoy BDSM. If you do, great. Sometimes that's what a couple needs. But other times it's just about the emotional or energetic component, right? Is to find some sort of a balance in your life where if you're always someone who is in control of everything, being on the other pole to let go of that control and be taken up by something else. Or on the flip side, if you are never in control in your life, how powerful it can feel to then be in a position that is much more domineering. And so when these components are imbalanced in a person's life, that's where they can show up and become eroticized or sexualized through pornography and specific porn content. It helps them externalize the symbology and the drama that's going on within their psyche, so that when they see it outside, it feels a little bit easier to access, but it also doesn't quite ever help them resolve it necessarily. So examining the symbology of the porn that you consume or are attracted to, fetishes, these can be helpful for beginning to demystify what you're using that porn for, and can help you then wean off from, okay, I can only depend on the porn content. Instead, you can actually make changes in your life where you can then experience whatever it is you're trying to work out through pornography. So in the case of, let's say, a man who's constantly in control of his life, high-powered CEO, let's also say he has a girlfriend or is married, has a wife. Directly addressing that might be having a real conversation with her about, hey, I want to experiment around with some of our sexual dynamics. I want to try something where you're completely in control of me, and I just want to see what that's like. It's somewhat telling that if such a man can't experience this with his wife, but can with porn, right? He only seeks pornography to access this part of him, this kind of shadow, hidden side that he's not willing to show in front of his wife or girlfriend. Why is that? That is a much more important conversation than just quitting pornography. The third approach is meeting your needs directly. So I kind of already covered this with the first two, so just a brief summation is that when you can identify the needs underneath your behavior of seeking porn, you'll have a much more clear avenue to then address your actual life. Because the porn, yes, it is part of your actual life, but it's almost, it's an ancillary thing, right? It's a tool in which you're using to try to figure out all this other stuff, whether that's deep psychological wounds or symbols, things that you're trying to figure out, or it's a way of coping, right? And so when you can find the direct avenues, the porn in and of itself becomes of less interest because you don't need it anymore. It's not something that fulfills the same role anymore because you've learned how to address those needs more directly. So whether that's having a conversation with your spouse about the kind of sex that you want but you're afraid to ask for, or quitting your job, or making some big change in your life that up until this point you've been stuck, and so you've been dissatisfied, you've been churning, and you've been stewing over all this bitterness, and porn is something that helps you to release all that pent-up frustration. The fourth approach, which may apply to some men out there and some not, is to undo any religious programming. This is a huge issue for the men who do experience it, who have either religious upbringings or at some point became part of a religious structure or organization in which they deeply internalize these beliefs about their own bodies, sex, sexuality. This was the case for me, and for many years I had considered that my own body, my own sexuality was dirty, was sinful, was wrong. And the only proper place for it was in the context of marriage. And I think a very, maybe not intentional, but certainly a very traumatic part of religious programming around sex and sexuality is the deep amount of shame it can invoke on a person. So for myself, there was this period of time where I believed that any time I had not just watched porn or masturbated, but even if I had a lustful thought, right? I see a woman and I'm like, damn, she's hot. That was a trigger for me to believe that God was severely angry or disappointed with me. And because she's not my wife, I can't have that thought. So it just creates a huge amount of shame that I was stewing in. I've also had other men share that even having a wet dream was considered sinful. And so can you imagine, as a adolescent boy growing up with that kind of conditioning, right? You have a wet dream, which at that point you can't really control, right? You wake up, you find out, that you had a wet dream, and all of a sudden it's like, man, God's so disappointed in me, I need to repent, etc. These are very wounding narratives, and perhaps not all religious structures or organizations, even of the same, we'll say, faith, will have those beliefs. But for those who do, it creates a deep wound. And oftentimes, it's that shame cycle that men are addicted to, not the porn in and of itself. Now, I'll unpack this a little bit more. This shame cycle can be a big part of just the religious programming. Usually, though, it predates the religious programming, because a shame cycle can start just in your upbringing. Early childhood wounds or trauma, right? It can be as simple as the earlier story of the guy who's chronically angry, right? And then hearing, say, his mother say, good boys aren't ever angry. Good boys always behave. That in and of itself is a wound, right? To feel a part of you is unacceptable to your mother. So you got to hide it, you got to shove it down. So anytime you do, that man feels his anger, there's that shame. This is unacceptable. And when you combine that shame imprint with the religious programming, it doubles it or quadruples it. And one thing in my own experience that I've noticed with the religious programming that I went through is that a lot of the dogma and doctrine that was preached, a lot of the dogma and doctrine that was preached in the religious organization and faith that I was part of created this sense that the more that you are suffering, the more pious and holy you are. It was never said that directly, right? Nobody ever said, the more you're suffering, the more holy and pleased God is with you. Nobody ever said that. But it was just the sense of certain Bible verses, or just kind of a general attitude, or the culture was that if you are struggling, then you are doing well. You are fighting the good fight, right? You are doing the work that God wants you to do, because you were meant to suffer in this fallen world because you're not part of it. Something like that. And this is where it gets really twisted for a lot of men who have this religious programming, because you have a huge clusterfuck of things going on. You have the shame, self-loathing, coupled with the shame or self-loathing in context of also God, right? The all-omnipotent force. And then you have pleasure, right? Because as much shame as a man might carry, he's gonna experience pleasure when he looks at the porn that he's into. So you have this clusterfuck of shame and pleasure tied together. This creates a pretty gnarly neural pathway in your brain that connects pleasure with pain, pleasure with shame, pleasure with self-hate. So when I say the addiction oftentimes isn't about the porn, that it's about the shame cycle, that's what I'm talking about. Is that these men can't separate these things, right? It's both shame and pleasure, and eventually you get pleasure out of the self-loathing and the self-hate. It becomes a very, honestly, self-absorbed, narcissistic view of oneself. Because narcissism isn't just about, oh, I'm awesome and better than everyone else. Narcissism, another form of it, is deflated narcissism, in which you're completely coiled in on yourself, kind of like Eeyore in Winnie the Pooh. Oh, woe is me and nothing will ever work for me. Why does life have to be so difficult for me? That sort of attitude. it's no secret then here that you could have, to the previous points, the symbology of porn come in, right? Because when you have pleasure, you have shame or pain connected, you're going to try to work that out through specific porn content, right? And the real key here is to undo that religious programming and address that shame cycle, right? So that is one that I highly recommend working with a professional around, because it can be really hard to loosen that on your own. That was not something I had ever considered until my therapist pointed it out. And it was very surprising to me that he didn't have any judgment towards me. He didn't feed into the shame, which was what I was expecting or even wanting, because it's like, oh yeah, I'm a piece of shit and I'm an awful human being. Of course, yeah. I needed to hear that because that's true. That didn't happen. He was able to see me without any of that judgment. He's like, there's something deeper here. And that, once again, helped take the attention off of the porn as the issue, right? The symptom, and looking deeper. I was like, okay, so there's clearly something going on deeper within my psyche. And also how my body has been wired and conditioned, all these neural pathways. That's fucking interesting, because I could have never seen it that way. I need to look into this. Fifth approach is to cultivate and nurture your desire for pleasure. Kind of tying into the previous piece about religious programming and undoing that is you are meant to experience pleasure. I don't think you were meant to live in this life so that you can only experience suffering. And your capacity for desire and your capacity for pleasure is an innate part of you. And especially as a man, when you have these high levels of testosterone, when you have a lot of sex drive, good, you're working properly. When you're attracted to women, when you feel this lust arising in you, good. That means you're functioning, right? It's part of just your biology. That's not something wrong with you. Though, yes, sometimes it can be very difficult to feel like, how the hell do I work with this energy? How the hell do I rein this in? And this is where cultivating and nurturing your desire for pleasure can be very powerful. This doesn't always mean you need to have sex with somebody. Cultivating your pleasure can be something as simple as dancing, singing, maybe gardening. Doing these activities that tap more into your creative aspect, your creative energy. Maybe even starting a home improvement project, right? Things that are fun, not just what we've been used to, which is you produce work, you need to be of value to society. It's kind of more of this, what we've been used to is like this hard, angular masculinity of do, produce, protect. Those are all important things, not to be thrown out. But you're also meant to enjoy things as well, to relax, to have fun. Another way you can work with this, with the sexual energy directly, is to do practices such as Taoist sexology or tantric practices that focus directly on your sexual energy. I'll put in links to some people that I can recommend who are doing this work. So Kim Anami, Sasha Cobra, Mantak Chia, Johnathan White. These people who have also talked about sexual transmutation or sexual alchemy. You're using that sexual energy to do whatever you want within your life. Your sexual energy can be a powerful vehicle for healing, for creating the life that you want, for connecting. And these are things that can be really hard to acknowledge or even accept if you have that previous point I mentioned, the heavy religious programming that has so much shame around these things. It never occurred to me until another person I was working with, in this case was a woman, it was an energy healer, that she brought up that you can separate masturbation and pornography. That never occurred to me. I always thought they were linked. Porn and masturbation are PB&J. You can't have them separated. But when she brought that up and she encouraged me to explore that, it really did open up a whole different world for me, because one, it helped me to not focus on the porn as the problem, and two, it helped me tap into my own body, connecting with my own body, really feeling it, and being able to feel pleasure within my body. How does pleasure arise in my body? What are the specific areas that I feel it? And how does this energy shift over time? Oftentimes, these men who experience who have a porn addiction, are not connected to their bodies at all. They're very much in their heads, which is what the case was for me. The focus is all on, the visual stimulation, because men are very visual. Just heavy visual stimulation, focusing on the fantasy, and then you're just beating off. You're not even connected to what you're really doing necessarily. You're just really in that, what do you call it, that neurotransmitter hormone storm that's going on, and whatever other things you have attached to it. But the activity is all up here. This is something that for any men who still wrestle with a porn addiction, you can play with. The next time you find yourself looking at porn, masturbating, either during or after, have a check-in with yourself. Ask yourself, was I really present? Do I even remember what I was doing or how I felt? Or was it just like a haze, this trance I was in, and then after it's done, I was like, oh, I'm back in the world now. That's just a little awareness exercise you can practice. But main point, being able to cultivate and nourish your desire for pleasure, which includes conscious masturbation as part of that practice, can be a powerful tool for you being able to experience more flow and pleasure in your life, which is something that you were meant to experience. Last approach, number 6, is to let go of rigidity. Specifically, this message would pertain to those who have been very into the NoFap movement. I think it's great, and at the same time, there's such a heavy attachment to keeping your streaks. You're very attached to this outcome. There's this rigid attachment to it. And like I mentioned earlier, your subconscious mind is only focused on the energy of that intent, which is like, I gotta keep this, I can't mess this up. Meanwhile, another part of your mind, because you've invested so much tension, that part of your mind is thinking, when is the next time I'm gonna fuck this up? It's bound to happen. When you can let go of that attachment to outcome, when you can let go of the tension and rigidity to need to make this work on your time schedule, the more you'll find you'll be able to relax, have greater compassion and acceptance for yourself, for the pace that you're going on for this journey. When you can learn to lean into that acceptance, you'll be less hard on yourself. And speaking to my point earlier about the shame cycle, once again, this is where I think a lot of men can trip up. Because when you have that attachment to, I need to keep the streak, I can't fail, and then you do fail, inevitably, you beat yourself up. You do more of that self-flagellating, right? That self-mutilation, the, oh, woe is me, I suck, I'm a piece of shit. You're continuing to link that pleasure and shame cycle. You're continuing to move along that neural pathway, that conditioning. That doesn't allow you freedom. That only keeps you stuck. But when you can shift your attitude to that, even when you do look at porn, let's say, you slip up on your streak, just simply acknowledge it. Like, yeah, I did slip up. I don't feel the greatest about it. And allow yourself to just sit with the feeling for a bit. Sit with the disappointment. Sit with whatever thoughts are spinning in your mind. And then continue to move on with your life. Because ultimately, the rest of your life is where the focus will end up in the end. Your life was not meant to be about focusing on a problem, focusing on the problem of the porn addiction in and of itself. That is only the symptom to other areas of your life that are begging for your attention. So when you do slip up, it's okay. It's okay. Acknowledge that it happened and know that it's not the end. This is a process. It's not something where, once again, the Western mind, Western medicine model is, you got a problem, we got a pill for that. You got a problem, we'll do surgery and we'll remove these organs, when maybe that initial issue is reflecting something deeper. And when you can hit on that, the healing and everything else takes care of itself. So these are the 6 alternate approaches that I have as a recommendation for men who still struggle with a porn addiction. If you can try these out, work with a professional, therapist or coach around these things, let me know. I would love to hear from you how you experience these changes, how these approaches might provide different results from what you've been used to with approaches you've tried on your own. Ultimately, who you are in your life is not defined by this one problem of the porn addiction. You're much more than that. You're far more expansive and bigger than that. And so when you can begin to lean into those other aspects of your life and how porn is only a symptom to any issues in those other areas of who you are, then you'll be able to live the life that you want to live. Then porn won't even be of interest to you, because it's like, my life is so much more interesting. There's other things that I want to do, other things I never imagined as possibilities. So yeah, porn exists, but I don't have any specific feeling towards it. Right? I think sometimes we can get trapped in these extreme feelings on one end or the other about something. You either really love it or you really hate it, but both intensity of feelings leads to an attachment. You can't hate yourself out of something. And even if at the end you still hate something, and let's say you've been on a long streak of not watching porn, and you also intensely hate the porn, are you actually disconnected from it? I would argue that you're not. There's still an emotional attachment to it. But when you can be in this very neutral point of, yeah, porn exists, and I don't have any particularly strong feelings about it. I see it as like dust on the table. I'll just wipe it off. But there's other things in my life that I'm much more interested in than just this problem that I've seen as the core of my life. I've oriented myself around me as a porn addict. When you can begin to let that go, that's where your life truly begins to expand. So that's all for today's video. And once again, I'd love to hear any feedback from the men who are watching. How did you feel? What are your thoughts with this video? And any other comments you might want to put. I'd love to read them. Thanks for tuning in to this video, and I will see you in the next one.